morning, Joel.
Morning, everybody. Well, I guess afternoon by you guys. How is everyone?
Good.
Excellent. Great. So it's my turn, right, Charles?
Indeed. You have
Oh,
30
awesome.
minutes.
Okay. So, well, first of all, greetings, everybody. My name is Joel Finklestein. I am the director and the chief science officer for the Network Contagion Research Institute. We are an organization that uses scaled analyses and machine learning, neuroscience, psychology, engineering, political science, and everything under the sun in order for us to basically identify and forecast threats from the social cyber domain. So we're not really an expert organization in anti-Semitism at all. And we really are not experts in any one given kind of area. We have developed a kind of tool set that is uniquely suited towards resolving emerging threats. Now, those tools, which we use in combination with officials in law enforcement and the psychology and academics and intelligence analysts, like these tools have been used to assess threats of financial disinformation that are assailing markets. They've been used in combination with data from Google and Walmart to understand vaccine reluctance. And they've been used to detect emerging militia threats that, from white supremacists and accelerationists. And often the capacities that we've developed give us a unique kind of insight into these kinds of threats by studying them in the same way we would study the emergence of viruses or information contagions. Our ability to kind of model the climate of problems online often gives us insight into what's going to emerge in the real world. So today, I'm going to give you an example of how we've used these tools on issues of anti-Semitism in ways that could have applications for understanding the different kinds of extremist-coded languages and ideological flavors of anti-Semitism. And we're going to drill down into a specific case use for why these kinds of approaches could prove really valuable, both from a scientific standpoint and from the standpoint of critical intelligence and threat detection. So today, I'm going to talk a little bit about what happened with a report that was done by Amnesty International in February of 22. And the goal is to understand how our globe can get kind of encircled by social cyber forces that can manufacture biases in ways that really aren't reflective of reality and that really use a lot of underhanded, non-transparent mechanisms in order to dominate the impression of specific issues in ways that are probably not healthy to having a transparent, reasonable discussion about facts. So our analysis uses machine learning. It ingests data largely from Twitter, but other platforms, and uses semantic analyses from natural language processing, which is a scaled capacity to understand language contextually with machines, and to analyze it that way. And we're looking at the influence of bots, of extremist groups, and we're trying to understand how a kind of feeding frenzy can emerge around themes of social justice in a way that is kind of arguably partisan and discriminatory. And we're going to try to understand how that happens and if it happens and what the impact of that is. So we looked at the report that Amnesty released. Amnesty International is a human rights organization that's fairly prolific and well known. And in February of 2022, they issued a report about Israel being an apartheid state, and tried to create in that report a kind of analysis justifying why they thought that title was worthwhile. So what we wanted to understand is, okay, what was the overall impact of that online? Can we see what that actually did? And then what was the online distribution and reception? What are the audiences that are disseminating this? And how do they weigh out in terms of their their balance in reporting on these issues, especially with the reception of the report. Are there specific information operations, that is to say, and attempts to sway or influence that are either covert or overt in a coordinated fashion in order to fabricate consensus around highly partisan reporting or media? And finally, can we compare what happens in Israel with the reputation of other states that do things that are way more terrible to see if this was really merited? Right? In other words, is there an attention problem that needs to be addressed, that people don't know that something like apartheid is happening in Israel, and is there an even-handed approach in the application of the language and the concerns of human rights? So that's the sort of goal of the report. So the first thing we did was we used scaled analyses and time series in order to understand the overall impact of the report. What we found was that when the report came out, there was roughly a doubling in the mention of the term Zionist, but there was nearly an increase by an order of magnitude in terms that relate to apartheid. So the top associations with Israel that, as this came out, were all about all the conflict, accusations of apartheid. There's a couple of really interesting hashtags that showed up: End Israeli Apartheid, Apartheid Israel. And you can see here this increase by roughly an order of magnitude when the Amnesty report actually came out in mentions of the term apartheid. So that's pretty substantial, but it went down to baseline fairly quickly after the report came out. Now, the thing to notice about the report is that, we saw that this increase in activity, we saw like associations of apartheid and demonizing social justice slogans becoming the top hashtags associated with Israel across all of Twitter. So when you look up the term apartheid, these are the top associated hashtags: End Israeli Apartheid, Free Palestine, BDS, Apartheid Israel, Palestine, Dismantle Apartheid. It's virtually all about Israel, with some interesting ones like Israeli crimes and End Israeli Apartheid. Well, that's interesting, because what that suggests is that these campaigns can cause a dislocation of the language of human rights, so that words such as apartheid come to mean one and only one nation, and not for a small network of people, but for an entire platform. That suggests that the language is being dislocated in ways that are partisan. So this huge increase in apartheid chatter by an order of magnitude, it's not that Israel becomes about apartheid, it's that apartheid becomes all about Israel. And that is the definite, that's like a conspiracy. Whenever you have this kind of unilateral villainization with a kind of colorful magnitude that's on one and only one country, that's a kind of like dominance conspiracy that's being generated at a huge scale. So let's talk about the online distribution and reception of the report. We looked at the associated URLs, the websites that were associated with terms like Zionist, apartheid, etc., after the report's release. And what we found was that of the top 20 URLs that were shared the most, that most of them came from what I would call the usual suspects. These are organizations that when they report on the subject of affairs in the Middle East, especially as it pertains to Israel, will tend to portray Israel overall in a negative light. And the 17 of the top 20 websites were essentially negative portrayals of Israel. There were 3 exceptions in the entire of the links that were shared around this, and only 3. One was a comparative analysis of what Israel does with China by the Times of Israel. And 2 were by minority Congress members in the United States, Representative Richie Torres and Representative Chantel Brown. Notably, none of the links were in the top 20, were shared by Jewish advocacy groups, or groups whose job it is to be able to weigh in on these issues. That suggests that the groups that are agitating and the activist groups that are seeking to work on behalf of these causes are not having an impact, and maybe somewhat bubbled in. When we look at the dissemination of terms like apartheid, we want to see who is it that's responsible for most of the chatter. And we find that all of them are accounts that are essentially promoting negative portrayals of the state of Israel. Virtually none of them in the top 10, none of them at all, are accounts that favor Israel when we look at the users who are most prolific in disseminating those terms. Now, one of the things that we can do is we can use natural language processing and machine learning over these comments in order to better ascertain specific kinds of information operations that might be deployed by these individuals. So what we did was we noticed that there was a huge increase in chatter around the term anti-Semitism during this time. And we wanted to characterize what the top associations were with anti-Semitism. So we used a natural language processing algorithm called word2vec, which allows us to understand how closely associated words are within a given corpus. The top associations for anti-Semitism after the report came out were terms like, it's about the critics. They're weaponizing anti-Semitism. It's a conflation. It's spurious. It's meaningless. This is not a group of marginal extremists. This is the entirety of Twitter. The top associations for anti-Semitism, as this term comes out, are almost uniformly about how meaningless that term is. Now, we can go deeper into the program to understand and create what's called a topic network. This shows and portrays in 2 dimensions the relationality of language within the corpus in terms of meaning space, and it enriches the nature of the dialogue surrounding anti-Semitism as a seed word. Anti-Semitism is not just a conflation. Apparently, it's used to demonize Goyim. A lot of the signals are being sent to the IHRA itself that the term anti-Semitism is becoming weaponized, that there's a conflation between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, that this is being done politically for convenience, and it's reckless and meaningless. And actually, it's actually itself a form of slander. The term itself is a conspiracy to silence the critics of Israel. That's seriously preemptive, right? That suggests that there is a very strong push for people to defang accusations of anti-Semitism, and it's a preemptive form of what I call preemptive meta-discrimination. Preemptive meta-discrimination is a kind of discrimination that ensues not by saying you're hateful and beastly or whatever. It's you portray the other person as being the hater, right? And therefore, victim status can't be attributed to the person who is hateful. They're the powerful person who's hateful. Victim status doesn't apply. That's a scheme. That's a preemptive attack against them being able to be perceived as victims, because they're the preemptivity is that they themselves are kind of like the power brokers who are responsible for things. Thus, victim status doesn't apply. So that kind of strategy appears to be a widespread one, and this is not some extremist network. This is across the entirety of Twitter that we're able to see this. So that's really shocking, and it probably leaves Jews really vulnerable, would be my guess. That the other thing we can do when this happens is we can do network analysis to understand how the most prominent users are gaining user share in the ecosystem of attention. So this is an interactive network of the top users who disseminated the words apartheid, Israel, Zionism, etc., during the release of the report in the days shortly after. And what we find is that most of the conversation is being driven by the blue here, and that blue is all Amnesty International. There are a few exceptions. Chantal Brown, Richie Torres, and Mike Pompeo. So the thing about this is that while Amnesty and some of its most closely associated influencers are by and large dominating the conversation, we can see that the people who are really effective at getting through are actually and defending Israel are not Israelis and they're not Jews. They're people who represent groups that are neither one of those things. There is sound psychological reason for this being the case. It's been shown in a number of psychological studies that people who are blamed are less effective at defending themselves because they have a vested interest in doing so. When others speak out on their behalf and they rebut the blame, it's seen as being about the fault in the norms that we all share, and not a personal defense by an individual who is incentivized to defend themselves. And so one of the things that's notably missing from this graph are any Jewish influencers of any note who are nominally responsible for advocating on behalf of Jews in Israel. I think that's interesting. Finally, we can look at information operations. This includes things like putative coordinated behaviors. So here's a good example of one. Look at this. This is a hashtag called Israeli crimes. Would you believe this? Every day at 1600 UTC, a whole bunch of people get on their computer and they all, at the exact same time, every single day, talk about Israeli crimes being a problem. That's amazing. And what a coincidence, right? So that's obviously not a coincidence because these obviously aren't people. And they're bots. And what we can see is that this spike from them emerges around February, January, regularly between 1600 and 1700 UTC all at once. This is a violation of the terms of service of Twitter, and it's demonizing Israel. It coincides actually with some very interesting stuff mentioned from BDS, Free Palestine. There's a lot of stuff this massive bot network will tend to sort of get their hands on and push conversation in ways that can drive it artificially through fabricating consensus. And it comes from some pretty interesting places. There's some pretty interesting places this place comes from, the network appears to come from. We can then use Bot Sentinel, which kind of evaluates bot-like activity and bot-like accounts. And we can take the accounts that are disseminating this, and what we see is that there's a lot of orange and red in this graph, right? And the more orange and red you see, the more bot-like the network is. And there are major nodes in this network that suggest there's a high degree of bot-like activity in this hashtag. This was one of the top hashtags shared around Twitter during this time, right? For that mentioned apartheid, Israel, Zionism, etc. So it was one of the top associations with the term apartheid itself. So the thing about this is that these institutional reports, like from places like Amnesty, can actually intersect this coordinated behavior from bot-like accounts in really interesting ways. Because Amnesty itself released a hashtag called End Israeli Apartheid in combination with the report. That was around here. And then something happened between 1600 UTC to 1800 UTC that all of a sudden this bot-like network just came out of nowhere and amplified that exact same hashtag. And wouldn't you know it, that network had a ton of users that also amplified this Israeli crime network thing. So Amnesty's hashtag gets amplified, and you can see that here. Here's the red group with taking the hashtag, and here's Amnesty, and it's more kind of somewhat authentic users. You can see these are actually distinct networks, but it shows how inauthentic actors can violate Twitter's terms of service, largely from foreign spheres, and they can take messages like the Amnesty report and its accompanying hashtag campaign and amplify it beyond anything Amnesty could do on its own. So that's interesting. And finally, we can do like a comparative analysis. Like, was this necessary? Did people not know that apartheid might be a problem in Israel or something? Maybe they didn't know that, and then this needed to be done because they don't know about all the stuff happening in the West Bank, and people just aren't educated. There are social justice concerns in Israel. Maybe that's the issue. So we did a hashtag analysis with China and Israel in the days before the campaign. And the day before the report was released, we took a 10-day time period, and we did a hashtag analysis in January. These are the top associations that were associated with China at that time. There's only 2 social justice hashtags at all, and they don't pertain to anything happening in China. There's a network that was petitioning China to get involved in what was happening in Tigray with the ongoing violence there. Sorry, excuse me. My apologies. By contrast, Israel like half of the hashtags associated with Israel during this time were already about boycotting and divesting and sanctioning from it, and about its indiscriminate acts and killing, including its siege on Gaza, its siege, quote unquote, on Gaza. And there's Israeli crimes alive and well. So the interesting thing is that that really the yardstick for this obviously is not about human rights issues, right? And obviously it's not about education either, because people seem to know a lot about how bad things are in Israel way before this report came out, right? All right, so our assessment is that Amnesty's report didn't serve to stir significant controversy, but man, it sure is an interesting playbook. It shows this dog whistle effect where it can recruit mass dissemination of a dominance conspiracy in the Twitter sphere. And that is, I mean, that really is a kind of anti-Semitic conspiracy, in my opinion. Influence operations and putative coordinated and authentic online networks can interact with accounts like Amnesty to amplify the report's opprobrium and blame. And much of that content is actually anti-Semitic in nature. I mean, it's even accusing anti-Semitism itself of being a kind of conspiracy. The organic and inorganic amplification dwarfs dissenting voices altogether. There's nothing in this thing that's like a pro-Israel voice from Israel at all. And these effects appear to substantially alter online discourse, and they affect a clear double standard that's fabricated globally across social networks. We see this in Twitter. We see it in a ton of other social networks too. And so that describes how an industry of media can latch onto this stuff and write reports that they know are going to get likes. There's a built-in audience for it, guys. Right? I think it's notable. Anyway, I think that there's a couple notable things that come out of there that people that can actually make a difference, are people who need to be concerned about human rights. I think that's the thing that's so the take home from this data is that if people are serious about human rights, they should really take a look at what's happening here, because this isn't about anti-Semitism. I really actually think it's about human rights. I feel like this is the people who are pushing on this stuff, the reason to stop them is because it's completely corrupting the language of human rights in ways that go far beyond anything I've shown you here. So anyway, that's my presentation. Thank you guys for listening. You've been a really good audience, and I know there's a lot of smart people in ISGAP, so you guys probably have a ton of questions, and I'll try to answer them. Is that Charles? No. Can you guys hear me? I'm not getting any questions.
Miss the hand clapping and hear the questions.
Hey, can you hear me?
I can hear you, yes.
Hey, so thank you so much for that. This is a question to both of you. What is the advice that you may have for people who are online? Because I am fairly active online and I have had my account suspended. I have posts removed. In the last 24 hours, I've seen 2 kind of Jewish advocates online had their accounts shut down. Do you have any advice for how people handle this? Because it seems to be a numbers game. There's just not, I mean, as you pointed out, Joel, the influencers or the advocates online aren't even making a splash. So yeah, that's my question.
Is that directed to me? I assume it is.
Yes.
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, I get you're asking the biggest question, right? You're going right to the biggest question. So what do we do about all this?
Yeah.
So
Precisely.
I think that's the best question. That's the best question. I feel I feel like we are with the okay. This is how I'm gonna answer that. I feel like we are with the social media platforms where we were with the tobacco companies back in the 50s and 60s.
Okay.
This stuff is bad. It's really, really bad. And it's not just bad for Jews. It's bad for everybody. Have you seen what TikTok is doing to little girls? Have you seen what's happening? There is evil on YouTube that doesn't sleep. Right? And people are getting day in and day out, they're spending time on this thing. It's not good for people. It's not good. It's really, really not good for people. So that's obvious. And whatever needs to happen, as usual, The anti-Semitism is just a symptom. It's a symptom of a kind of something that's like systematically dehumanizing us. So we have to think about, that's what I mean about this being a problem about human rights, right? Like, that's what I mean. Like, this really is an issue, but I don't think it's the issue we think it is.
Okay.
So we have to fix, we have to address the fundamental problems in the business model of social media. And we have to be able to sort of like find a way to make sure that people have a more participatory role in their lives. And they're not just voyeurs of endless material that are being fed that like cows and grazing on that, because that's not what a human being is. And until we change that, I don't really see how that's going to change. And whose job is it to change that? Well, my guess is that like, you asked what you can do. Okay, so, you know, I think that just like when there's a virus out there, there's a number of ways to answer that question. Get a mask on. Start with that. You know, start with the hygiene of this stuff, and like I think that's like and then find other sane people of sound mind to find ways to push against the big problems. I think that's what I'm doing.
Okay. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
Thank you. Hi, to both of you. Thank you both for these presentations. It's very timely for a purely selfish reason. I'm a scholar in Canada, and I've just been asked by the Canadian government to consult with them on proposed hate crime legislation on the internet. And this is not my area, so I'm so grateful to get these presentations from both of you. And I want to give you a moment to say, like, what would you tell the Canadian government? Is there anything that can be legislated? Do you see anything that is so clear and egregious that with our scholarly concerns about free speech, you still can point to something that can be done? Is there a it's kind of horrible putting you on the spot this way, but
no, you guys are asking like the biggest questions. Sure. I'm so glad we're asking those questions because they're the hardest to answer. Like, of course they are, but I feel like we're at a point where we need new thinking. Look, I've developed proposals on this with others that I think there's sensible policy changes we can make that could have an impact in the online world. But they require, look, one of the things that's missing is that, like, when you think about a referee, like a referee has a few limitations. First of all, they can't be in the game. That's one of the things about a referee cannot play in the game. A good ref has got to be removed from the game and not on either team's side, right? So, I mean, one of the things that's obviously missing is having a believable referee in the online domain. That's completely missing. And a referee's uniform is really important. It's like, what's the black stripe and what's the white stripe, right? Like, how do you separate that out? How do you make the calls? So I think we need institutions that are believable and credible for being able to make those kinds of discriminations in ways that are representative of people's norms. And what's important is that organization has to have enough buy-in and popular support and really, really, really be something that's apolitical. The government's not credible for doing that, because what we've seen is that as governments get involved in the policing disinformation game, then one person's fact becomes another person's disinformation campaign. And I will be the judge of that. Thank you very much. So what I'm advising the Canadian government to do, what I've advised them to do, is to create an independent, non-governmental organization that actually is responsible for doing this and is fundamentally driven by adversarial collaboration, is fundamentally driven in ways that are duly representative of the arguments that people are having and can be seen as even in fair balance. Now, that seems like it's like, oh, who does that? But we do that all the time with things that matter, like the Federal Reserve, and we have private organizations that govern complex things. Hey, Charles.
Sure. Hi. No, I was just going to say very quickly in response to your very important question and mandate. Joel, I don't mean to insult you, but thank God in Canada, we have hate legislation and there are limits of freedom of speech, unlike the First Amendment in the United States. And there have been instances where information coming from servers in the United States has been deemed as hate speech and they've been blocked. So there is a bit of a potential for more traction to deal responsibly with speech in Canada. And I know people that are engaged in the Canadian context, and I'd be happy to speak with you. And I believe that Canada can become a beacon of having a democracy with free speech, but never allowing or limiting the capacity to incite against identifiable groups with hatred. That's against the law in Canada. So I think we could become a beacon potentially for the world, given that model. But I digress. Mr. Sutherland.
You're so much better at saying this stuff than I am, Charles. No wonder they put you in front of all these lawmakers.
First, I think Charles and I could have a nice debate on hate speech and the appropriateness of banning it by law. But I want to ask, I want to make just a brief comment and then ask you a question. The brief comment is there was a remarkable statement last month on Twitter by the Secretary General of the United Nations. I don't know if you saw this. Antonio Guterres tweeted out of the blue, ostensibly, that 1/5 of all comments on Twitter, not 1/5 of all comments about Jews on Twitter, or 1/5 of all comments about the Holocaust on Twitter, but that 1/5 of all comments on Twitter were Holocaust denial or distortion. You check it. I can send it around if you'd like to see it. Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations. I was blown away. I'm happy to. I'm happy to send it to you. That's what I wanted to ask, whether or not you thought this was even remotely
be the case. I mean, look, I can show you right now. We can do it right now. Hold on a second. I'm gonna get to my computer. We'll find out what's happening on Twitter right now.
The United Nations. I'm
No,
happy to send you
I get that.
Guterres'
But
quote.
people don't know what's actually going on in social media. Hold on. Let me just. Oh, by the way, I want to show you guys something. Check this out. So here's what's happening like right now on Twitter. So after that Israeli operation, here's the end Israeli apartheid hashtag. Here's Israeli crimes, right? Right. These guys recirculate this stuff all the time. Israeli terrorism, free Palestine. So, but then here's Holocaust. It barely registers. So you can see that
Right. That's what I thought. So I will send Charles the tweet and you can debunk it. So but my question for you, I mean, I heard two remarkably sophisticated technical projects, but actually addressing two very different types of issues. And so my question for you, which I thought it was a fascinating look at how anti-Semitism metastasizes online by looking at these comments, but how do we know if these are not just, fringe people talking to fringe people over and over and over again? How do we know the qualitative value of this, which is slightly different than this other study, which takes a look at, which are the most influential mainstream influencers? I think what you just did is terrific to look at how things evolve and let you know where it's heading. But how do you look at the sort of relevance of who these people are?
Yeah. Part of the issue is we don't look at the individual, right? For ethical reasons, we have all these comments and stuff, and we don't try and judge whether a comment is anti-Semitic or not based on the identity of the person making it, right? We're trying to think of anti-Semitism as a kind of objective phenomena that you can express anti-Semitism without being conscious of it yourself, without in any way being a anti-Semite. Anti-Semite. I think it's important to distinguish the two things between anti-Semitism on one hand and being an anti-Semite on the other, because I don't think they necessarily always match. In terms of whether the people we're looking at are extremists, the comments that we're getting are similar to what he's looking at. He's looking at Twitter. We look at Twitter. We look at responses to, Guardian, BBC, Die Zeit, Die Welt, kind of French mainstream newspapers and stuff, including their comment threads and on their own sites and on the Facebook threads. And it may be that they are invaded by people who are kind of, you know, radical and obsessed with this stuff, and a lot of them are obsessed with it. But a lot of it, you can just tell from the way it's written. There are people who are interested in the topic, particularly the Israel-Palestine stuff, but they're pretty standard ways of talking about it. It's nothing, or maybe I would argue that maybe the distinction between extremists and mainstream is not quite as distinct as we might think, and the ideas kind of float between those milieus. I mean, an interesting project would be to look at the way that Israel, for example, gets spoken about in kind of explicitly extremist milieus, and compare with the linguistic structure of the way that they talk about it with how it's used in kind of, you know, the Guardian comment section, and see whether there's any differences there or whether they flow. But and the other problem is that I think that these comments are there on publicly accessible Facebook pages or Twitter pages forever until they're deleted. So it may be, yes, this one conversation that you're looking at might be by a couple of people who are a bit crazy and are just completely obsessed with it. But what they're saying exists forever and ever and ever, and can be accessed by pretty much anyone who looks at the comment thread. So I think maybe that this kind of, you know, radical disjuncture between, you know, extremists and mainstream people doesn't quite hold in terms of the way that the internet works now, I think.
So if I can comment on that, I think that there are, look, our studies have shown, like, we got our start back in Pittsburgh with the attack on the synagogue, and we reported 2 weeks before that happened in the Washington Post that we felt a spill out of violence was imminent on this platform that the attack came from, and that it would be based on this replacement theory stuff, that it was, and that that would be anti-Semitic, and it was. So that's how we got our start. And, you know, the thing is that what people need to understand is that there are two systems of distinct violence. They converge in the end, but they're really distinct. The extremist stuff that we're seeing now on the right is stylized very differently than what's happening on the left. And the competing systems work in the following fashion. On the right, you see marginal subcultural forums that are countercultural, that generate deeply coded language in bizarre ways, that can get a few actors to be able to be celebrated in the lineage of heroes by taking out like numbers of Jews, or by perpetrating attacks that and disseminating anti-Semitic conspiracy and romanticize their visions, right? And that then gets that trickles up, so to speak, and allows for leaders to take advantage of the coded language. There's a whole ecosystem that can generate a highly racialized version of anti-Semitism. So on the left, it's far more diffuse, right? Instead, what you have is that you have a kind of a system of anti-Semitism that's encoded in the language of social justice. It's fabricated largely through an authoritarian history with the Soviets, and fabricated through that lineage. And its focus is so asymmetrically on Jewish nationalism, but ultimately it argues it's not anti-Semitic in theory, but it sure is in practice. When we see surges of this activity, of the activity that I mentioned online, it doesn't happen in subcultural forums. It happens in the culture, because that's the culture, not the counterculture. And when it gets in the atmosphere, Jews get attacked. And their code words come from the academy, not from these underground subcultural forums, with a high priest class that has an intellectual designation to be able to articulate like hateful terms and get away with it because it sounds funny. So I think that basically describes and characterizes the two different systems, but I think they're both demonstrably anti-Semitic, and that can help us parameterize how we're thinking about the problem we're trying to.
Joel, what are the terms you're referring to? Terms like what?
I mean, a lot of the stuff on the left is couched in identitarian language from like the diversity and inclusion and that kind of material. So the poisoning of terms like, you know, colonial, the way that the Jew is considered white, there's a whole constructed language that essentially serves the same purpose on the left that the zany conspiracy language serves on the right. Hey, good to see you. How are you?
Hi. So I have a question for each of you. your process is profoundly labor intensive at the beginning. And you said you hope that, eventually you'll have an AI machine learning that'll be able to sort of take over that stuff, that part of it. How sure are you're going to last long enough before you get to that? Because that's a very big deal.
Well, it would never be that the AI takes over completely because it's changing. So you constantly have to feed it with new.
I know, but that's a problem in and of itself.
In terms of getting an AI that works, and in terms of getting one that you could use, actually that Facebook could buy and use, I don't know, 10 years, I don't know. But there are people who are working on these things now who are getting more and more effective on it. Okay. So I think you could get to a point where you start integrating some of those insights over the next few years, I think. But the other way of doing it is that we think you can do better training of the humans who are making these decisions.
You're training the data so that the data can do that.
No. So we're trying to publish our guidebook that we use when we annotate our comments, which then you could use for training Facebook moderators, Twitter moderators. So they actually recognize. So some of the more glaring examples, when you think this is clearly anti-Semitic, what is wrong with you? That would, so already you can make an impact that way, I think.
All right. Joel, one word that didn't appear in what you said at any time, interestingly enough, in some way, was accountability. And what I'm talking about accountability is for those who do what we are talking about.
Yeah,
right?
You're totally right.
Everyone gets away with murder. Period.
Yeah, totally. You're totally right. I mean, look, that's where I think this could be useful. Like, if we can show that these things are connected to anti-Semitic attacks, if we can show that, like, it's like CO2 in the atmosphere or cigarette smoke in your lungs. That's what the stuff is like. And what we need to be able to figure out is, like, when is a platform accountable, right? We figured out when a newspaper is accountable. We invented a term for that. It's called incitement for genocide, right? That's obviously happening. That's obviously happening.
But in the old days, people would be put in the stocks and you would come and throw stuff at them. You would shame people, right? I mean, sorry, but they did. That used to happen a lot, right? Nobody's shamed. You get away with anything. You can send out a death threat. You can do all this stuff. And it's just nowhere. People are becoming more and more afraid to step up to do things, right? So, where is the equivalent, or how do we get the equivalent of putting people in the stocks, putting companies in the stocks, right? Making them accountable? That's what I care about.
That's totally a great question. I think that's the right question.
Okay, final question. We're running out of time. Chelsea.
Okay.
Sorry, not sure.
Hi. I don't know if you can see me right now, but I think we just emailed recently. So, and I've been following your work for a while, so it's very interesting to me. But this is a question for both of you guys. So do you guys think that using AI technology to track anti-Semitism sort of on an ongoing long-term basis could actually be used as a tool for foreign policy as well, to predict global escalations per se, and conflicts that are infused with anti-Semitism, like the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, or in general, the rise of totalitarianism? So have you thought of those implications? And also, is that a direction that your organizations are looking into going as well?
Yeah, do you mind if I take the first shot at that, Charles?
Okay.
So
Go ahead.
Definitely, I mean, that's 100% a thing. And like, one of the things we're doing is we just showed you these topic networks that we're developing over online material, and we've used those to sort of rapidly dissect and contextualize different narratives. Well, we're doing the exact same thing with Nazi newspapers and Soviet newspapers. We're doing the exact same thing with, like, literature from various fields. Like, our goal is to be able to look at that in its totality and create a genealogy of hatred. And we need that not because we need a history lesson, guys. We need it to detect this stuff. And we need to see the influence that it's had in the real world and use it for creating transparency. That is going to give us better capability to detect this stuff now. But we've been lying to ourselves for so long that we need some really, really shrewd analysis to show how we've been doing that. And uncover exactly what the genealogy history of this stuff is, so that we can really expose it now.
Thanks, Joel. Matthew, final word.
Final word. Yeah, I do think it'd be very useful for tracking social trends and seeing the spread of ideas. I'm personally I think the link between what happens online and when you're talking about major geopolitical events, invasions, I think there needs to be a lot more study of how these two things relate, because I don't think it necessarily there's a big surge of people talking about something on Twitter and then
because we were talking
No,
about
excuse, we have to, we can't, that ask the question and we got to break.
but yes, I do think tracking these social trends is important, but there are other layers of analysis that have to be brought in as well, I think. But yeah.
Cool. So thank you. So Joel and Matthew, thank you very much for a wonderful contribution. Okay, so our week is over. Daphne has Daphne or El Shaday's final comments. It's all, I thought you wanted to say something. Anybody else? Any final thoughts?
I did track down that statistic that you referenced, and it was from a UNESCO report on social media distortion and denial of the Holocaust.
Can you circle?
It was 1/5 of all Holocaust related.
1/5.
That makes a lot more sense. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, cool.
So Shabbat Shalom, everybody. So good to see everyone here. You guys are awesome.
Joel, you and the chief owe me an email.
We'll get it to you, buddy. So good to talk to you.
Nice to see you. Be well, be well.
Shabbos, bye.
Shabbos. All right, so anyways, I just want to, it was